It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to celebrate the 25th anniversary today of the Human Frontier Science Program. It's an illustrious community which gathers together here in Lugano to honor the past achievements of this wonderful organization, but also to look into the future. No wonder then that it was decided early on to make human frontiers the subject of this afternoon's discussion. Human frontiers are different for an architect, different for an astronaut, and different for scientists.
It's a vast and exciting topic, and it invites many questions. How do we identify a frontier? How do we recognize a frontier if we find one? Are there ways, particular ways that we should fund research at the frontier? And indeed, are there rules that one can prescribe for funding such explorations? We're blessed with an amazingly qualified panel to discuss these issues. Susan Hockfield was, of course, president of MIT between 2004 and 2012, and was indeed on the council of HFSP in the late 90s. Torsten Wiesel was awarded the 1981 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, together with David Hubel for their work in the visual system, and has been president of Rockefeller University, and of course was the Secretary General of HFSP between 2000 and 2009. And Claude Nicollier, as you've heard, is Switzerland's one and only astronaut. And if my maths is correct, I think he's traveled 17.5 million miles through space. So the format for this panel is that each of our panelists is going to give a short statement, no more than 10 minutes. And then I'm going to invite them to sit down and we're going to enter into some discussion. And then I will at various points come out to the audience to invite your comments, thoughts, questions. So if we may start with Claude Nicollier, please, the floor is yours.
I'll talk about a frontier or going beyond a frontier that I had the privilege of visiting myself on 4 occasions in the 90s, the frontier of space. And I can tell you that when you enter this frontier, you discover a world of amazing beauty, a world of silence, and a world of great opportunities. Beauty in space is everywhere. On Earth, the beauty is especially in the works of Mario Botta. But in space, it's everywhere. And if you look at this picture, I did not go so far in space, beyond that frontier, which is in a way the top of the atmosphere beyond which you are in space. This is a picture taken by Cassini, the spacecraft Cassini, which is orbiting the planet Saturn. And taking remarkable pictures of this wonderful planet, about 8 times the size of the Earth, with a ring, and studying also many of its 60 satellites. And the little dot that you see here, this is the Earth. And if you look at the original, you see 2 dots. There is the Earth and the Moon. And the distance between Saturn, respectively Cassini, and the Earth is about 1 light hour, at a speed of 300,000 kilometers per second. This is space. It is beautiful. And it's a world of opportunity, of course, for practical applications of space, and you know them, but also for discoveries of absolutely superb and wonderful worlds. Humans and robots go to unusual places, have gone, still go, and will go in the future to unusual places. You see here the space shuttle on one of its last trip to the International Space Station, picture taken from the International Space Station during the slow approach of the shuttle to the ISS. Beautiful picture. Space is beautiful. We go to these unusual places to learn and to discover. This is, of course, a picture of the Apollo program. This is Apollo 16, the mission before last of the Apollo program. It was in April 1972. The last one was Apollo 17 in December 72. And you see Charlie Duke, the commander of the lunar module, picture taken by John Young, the commander of this mission. We go to space to learn and to discover. Now, this is a picture that I added here because I think it's interesting. There are many life scientists here, and they know better than I do about this, but I think about 300, maybe 500 million years ago, many people think, not everyone, but many people think that life left the lukewarm waters and went on solid ground. And it was, of course, a major step in the evolution of life on this planet. If it had not happened, we would not be here to talk about it. Yeah? And it was a difficult step. And the ones who stayed in the water, of course, many of them still in the water, they were wondering why we go on land when it's so difficult to make this step. I personally believe that the fact that we go into space corresponds to a major step in the evolution of life, not on this planet because we live it, but in this corner of the galaxy. It gives us opportunities in the future. I'm convinced that long term, I'm talking long term, not next year or in 10 years or maybe not in 100 years, but it will give us a higher chance of survival for human species. This is not something official from NASA or ESA, it's my own conviction. Having gone into space, I've been raising our awareness about our place in the cosmos. This very small planet, I was amazed by how small the planet is. I've not seen it even from that distance. This is more during the Apollo program from the moon or on their way to the moon. I've seen it much closer than that. But seeing the Earth like a celestial body has been raising our awareness about our place in the cosmos, the fragility of our habitat. It's like a spaceship, a small spaceship, very modest spaceship with a 7 or 7+ billion crew members and no captain. It has given us the opportunity, and this is one of the great applications of space research, knowledge about planet Earth. We use a lot of sensors and cameras directed not upwards but downwards to planet Earth to be sure that we can support the effort of better preserving it for the future. It has been a wonderful opportunity for science. This is Mike Fowle, a US-British astronaut in the ISS using the glove box for experiments in medical sciences. This is Koichi Wakata, my hero, measurement of a maximum volume O2 during exercise in the International Space Station. I say my hero because it's a very good friend of mine, and I always considered him as my hero. Every time I see him, I say my hero, and he says my hero because I'm supposed to be his hero. Just to show you the very close relationship I have with this wonderful, wonderful astronaut of Japan, Koichi Wakata, who was the first commander of ISS from Japan about a year ago. We discover also other worlds. This is not the Sahara Desert, this is Mars. Picture taken with Mars Express. It's an ESA spacecraft on orbit around the red planet, delivering very detailed pictures of the surface of Mars. And look, these fascinating discoveries. Clear indication that there was liquid water on Mars in the past. And you see these dried riverbeds on the surface of the red planet. Curiosity on Mars, as you know, we have a series of robots on the surface of Mars, and the last one that landed in the summer of 2012 is Curiosity, looking for not so much traces of life on Mars, because the likelihood to find existent life now on Mars is very remote, but more indication that there might have been life on Mars in the past when there was liquid water. Hubble. It's a real discovery machine that has allowed us since 1994 to make great discoveries about the universe and the physical processes in the universe. It's a joint project of the European Space Agency and NASA, allowing astronomers to have very detailed views of celestial objects. I'm just going to show 2 pictures taken by Hubble. Every week you have 2, 3, 4 very spectacular pictures from a science content, but from the beauty also. This is, as you all know, I'm sure you have recognized it, this is NGC 602. It's a nebula in the small Magellanic Cloud, which is a satellite of our galaxy visible from the southern hemisphere. And you have a cluster of stars with a stellar wind that has created a big bubble in that cloud of gas and dust. Beautiful picture. And in the background, you see some elongated objects. These are external galaxies, which typically are billions of light years away. And by the way, the deepest picture that has been taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, which is with its very, very, very good resolution, is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. The telescope remained pointed for 10 days in the same region of the sky, which is very small. This is about 1/15th of the diameter of the full moon. And during these 10 days, the telescope has gathered light or individual photons of very faraway objects. And we've seen on this picture hundreds and hundreds of galaxies. Nearly all of these objects are galaxies, except this is a star in the foreground. It's not a star in the foreground, but all the objects that are not accompanied with a little cross like this one are galaxies outside of ours. And this was an unbelievable result, showing the great richness in galaxies of the universe. We also learn about ourselves. This is a picture taken on my last mission in December 1999 with French astronaut Jean-François Clairvoy and myself. We learn about the behavior of human bodies exposed to that very unusual environment, which is a weightlessness. On the same mission, we did repairs on the Hubble Space Telescope. I'm here at the end of the robot arm replacing a fine guidance sensor as we were 600 kilometers above Australia. This is another picture of the spacewalk. I'm here together with Mike Fowle. We did brain surgery on Hubble. We replaced the main computer of the telescope. I have my safety tether attached here. You really need to do that, because if you detach yourself, don't hold the structure, and you don't have your safety tether, you become very rapidly a totally useless satellite of planet Earth, and we try to avoid that. You know? Humans and robots will be going further away. There are plans now to land people on Mars sometime on this century, maybe 2040, 2050, and maybe also explore asteroids. We'll definitely go beyond the low Earth orbit and even beyond the moon in a few decades from now. There are no limits, no limit to space. And again, it's a wonderful environment, and it offers us great opportunities for science and also eventually for better life here of humans on planet Earth. Thank you.
So much, Professor Nicollier, and among many other things, you remind us about the beauty of the frontier, something of which all scientists are aware, but often gets forgotten in all the day-to-day activity. So thank you. So next, may I invite Professor Susan Hockfield to give her statement.
It's hard to know how to follow that incredible description of the unknown. So I'm going to bring us back down to Earth and first of all, reflect a little bit on what the Human Frontier Science Project has done. I remember quite clearly 25 years ago when it was started and how unusual and breathtaking and an opportunity it created. For those of us who struggle at the bench to discover the unknown, one of the great challenges is funding for projects that reach beyond the known. Projects that reach outside of the normal boundaries of our disciplines or our countries. And the foundational objective of the Human Frontier Science Project to fund work that was cross-disciplinary and international was an entirely new approach to doing science. Now, by itself, that can sound pretty interesting, but I can tell you that as we think about where human frontiers are and how you discover them and how you get past them, they're hard to see. It's hard to see into the unknown. And as you are laboring at the bench, you can push your own ideas a certain distance. But in order to push them beyond that distance, it's very helpful to get insights from someone who has a perspective that is significantly different from your own. And the standard funding agencies are disciplinary, are based in disciplines. And if you want to do some work outside of your discipline, it's very hard to get funding for that. And so for the Human Frontier Science Project to decide from the outset that they would fund work that cross disciplines was an area that was almost impossible to access by the standard activities. The other thing, 25 years ago, those of you of a certain age will remember that there was tremendous almost a unique pull for science in the United States. And yet, Prime Minister Nakasone had the brilliant insight that in order to enhance the vitality of science worldwide, to create opportunities for people to collaborate across nations, would open up new kinds of intellectual boundaries, go beyond intellectual boundaries, and new ways of approaching research. A brilliant insight, and I have to commend Nakasone-san. Thank you for being with us, and we all honor your father for his insight and his persistence in knowing that this would create new ways of doing science. At this point, it's very different. I think more than 25% of publications now have authors that come from different countries. This was not the case in 2001, where I think only 16% had international representation among the authors. And now we have centers of research excellence all over the world, and I credit the Human Frontier Science Project for actually making that happen or accelerating its progress. So the question is, when you are working, what is a frontier? How do you get into the space that is unknown? We had an interesting discussion over lunch about dark matter and dark energy. I was reminded by a Nobel Prize winner at MIT, Jerry Friedman, just a few months ago, that in the physical universe, if we consider physical matter, we have ways of understanding about 4% of it. The rest is dark matter and dark energy. For me, this is very exciting because it means that 96% of the physical universe remains to be understood, and that will give the next generation plenty of work to do. As a biologist, however, when I last did laboratory work about 15 years ago, there were 3 classes of RNA, and much of the DNA in the genome was considered to be junk, because very little of it coded for protein. And now, of course, 15 years later, there are, I wouldn't even know what number to give the number of different classes of RNA, and junk DNA is not junk at all, but holds the code for regulation of all kinds of cellular processes. The slide that we just saw of the Hubble telescope looking at the distant reaches of the universe, that space was empty 15 years ago, and yet it is filled with objects that hold paralyzingly interesting interest for us. One of the great questions for me as a neuroscientist is, what is it that propels human beings to want to understand the unknown? Why would we crawl out of the sea to explore the land? Why would we take a piece of tissue from a light microscope to an electron microscope and beyond to understand what exists in the territories that look empty? And the people who decide to engage in these kinds of what would appear to be fruitless, perhaps meaningless to some activities, I think is one of the great mysteries of the human mind. Whether neuroscience will get to understanding that, I don't know. But our job as scholars, as scientists, and as academic leaders is to set up the conditions that allow the human mind to reach into the unknown in directions that have not yet been explored. Many people have asked me whether I have missed the laboratory. I love doing science, and I love this challenge, the opportunity to see things that had never been seen before, to discover the occupants of areas that were considered to be unoccupied. It was marvelous. And then I had the opportunity to become an academic leader, and the opportunity to create conditions that allow others to explore the areas of the unknown has been an incredible privilege. And I will call out just for you one area where I see enormous opportunity. If we think about the 20th century and the technologies that have really dramatically changed our lives, they come out of a convergence of the physical sciences with engineering. So the beginning of the 20th century, physicists were beginning to understand the constituents of the atom. Engineers coming into collaboration with physicists not only gave them the technology to do those explorations, but also created entirely new products and new industries. In 1900, the electronics industry did not have a name, nor did the computer industry or the information industry. And the convergence between the physical sciences and engineering has transformed our lives more powerfully than any transformation, I would argue. We're now at a moment where biology has become a sufficiently high-resolution science that engineers have picked up the tools of biology and are creating new ways of thinking about the world, new ways of doing experiments, new technologies. And it's my view that the convergence of biology with engineering will be the technology story of the 21st century. It is already changing the practice of biomedicine. Nanoparticles that target cancer cells and deliver specially designed chemicals to destroy only the cancer cells and not touch normal cells. Or another example is in the realm of sustainable energy, where viruses have been persuaded to make batteries. And rather than standard battery synthesis that consumes an enormous amount of energy in a very heat-intensive process and spews out toxic byproducts, the virus-made batteries are made at room temperature without any toxic byproducts at all. So we will be seeing a world of biomanufacturing that not just produces new kinds of drugs, but new kinds of objects in new kinds of ways. I think this is a very exciting area. The challenge for academic leaders is how do you set up conditions that allow people to have conversations together that never before have spoken together? People who come together with different vocabularies, different understandings of what a scientific project might look like. And I think that one of the great opportunities for the Human Frontier Science Project is continue to create these venues for conversation that haven't really existed before, so that the individuals who have that great curiosity and the great power of their intellect can come together and discover what exists beyond today's frontiers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hockfield, for that extraordinarily eloquent summary. After listening to that, who would not want to become an explorer? So, Professor Wiesel, if you'd like to make your statement.
We need to keep in mind that the main focus of HFSP have been to support basic science. And the brilliant idea that Nakasone and his advisors had when it started was not only to make it international, but also bring scientists from different disciplines to collaborate and work together. Because we all know in science, us who study science, that new discoveries, new avenues, new opening come often to the development of new methods. And of course, you can look at biology that is now in a revolutionary phase, that technology, ability to build an electron microscope with nanoscience, is imaging that now is all based on physical discovery. So we in biology have to, take advice and technological knowledge from our colleagues in different disciplines, in chemistry and physics. And I think Susan's comment about engineering, I must confess that many biologists tend not to take engineers so seriously. I mean, it's not quite basic science, but it's applied science. And those of us who are purists might have felt that this is separate. This is applied science. But it turns out that today, when you develop new technology, new ways of studying problem, engineers become an essential part, as Susan pointed out, to carry out the kind of frontier science. Now, I feel that, the reference today to this space, and I always thought about the skull here defining the space inside our mind space, and that in order to, so there is an analogy here between the space exploration and the exploration of the mind and the brain, and the complexity of the two are not so all that different, perhaps, except the question you ask are. And I think if you look at the I mean, I look upon neuroscience as one of the frontiers that will remain a frontier for the next 100 years. And I think that we have to be careful with frontiers because it's people doing the sciences. Most of frontiers are created from the bottom up. It's not that somebody tells you should do this or this or that. It sort of grows harmonically from below like plants. And the ideas that is generated, that in turn create movement and interest in different directions, like in genetic or in cell biology, in neuroscience. So I think we should be humble in our way of trying to support science and see to how it develops most naturally. I think we should look upon science as a growing enterprise that you can't really direct it in a sense. You only need to see to that the wisdom about those who are in charge of administration and resources, that they also fully understand that this is a process that has its own dynamics, its own secrets that we need to support and give room. And I think also, you know, having spent 40 years in a lab, you try to do good experiments, but sometimes you fail. You have to be generous. You have to support people with new ideas, and say, and we did that. We do that in the HFSP. You ask for daring projects, they are risky, no preliminary work to show that this is possible, but to let people with ideas have an opportunity to test and see. This is not the common. Most agencies that support research are not as open and welcoming as HFSP is in to make the minds form the possible future and give resources for the talent and there are talents everywhere in the world. And I think my prediction is that in the future now, with the education is now not localized just to some high developed countries, but it's available now all over the world. In Pakistan or in Bangladesh, you get letters for email from students who have listened to a lecture. Oh, this is very interesting. So I think in the future we are going to see a different type of mixture of people at the frontiers of science. And we I think at HFSP welcome these people. There are no limits for students or brilliant, talented students or investigators to be part of this fantastic, I think, enterprise. And I think we should keep in mind that this would not have happened without the support from the Japanese government and of course, the idea from Mr. Nakasone originally. But there have been a steady support from over all this year, in spite of that. You know, Japan provides about half of the budget for HFSP. And in return, they have benefit from the honor of having one of the unique programs in the world of science. But the material benefit has not been as great as the investment as it has been for some other countries. So I think we should keep in mind that Japan has a way of looking at problems and a visionary kind of way. And I have been involved with the building of a new university, a graduate university in Okinawa. It's an interdisciplinary university, has no department, and scientists come from all over the world. At least half of them should not be Japanese, and the same is true for students. This is an entirely very adventurous experiment, similar to the HFSP to my mind, in that they want to bring scientists from all over the world together, and by having physicists and chemists and biologists meet in the corridors and do things have ideas and talk to each other. We have already seen, this opened 3 years ago, and we already see with very beautiful interaction between people from different backgrounds, cultural as well as scientific. So the world is going to change, I think, and we should be in the frontier. And I think, to my mind, HFSP is uniquely ready and part of this new development for the future. And I don't know if I have spent my 10 minutes, or not, but this is roughly what I wanted to say. I think we have, I think all of us, you know, I'm now 90, so I hope to see that the future will bring us many new discoveries and exciting news, not only in space, but also within our understanding of our minds and of the biology in general. And ultimately, obviously, we hope that through basic science and that this in turn will lead to possibilities of treating illnesses and disease. At the same time, this is, of course, the ultimate goal of a discovery, but you have to understand mechanism before you can really apply it in an intelligent and fruitful way.
Thank you so much. So now we have a chance to discuss frontiers in the context of HFSP's mission to think about how it approaches the next 25 years. And I'd like to start perhaps by taking some themes from His Excellency Mr. Nakasoni's presentation. And grand challenges were mentioned. And Claude, if we can start with you. In the context of space research, grand challenges serve a very important purpose, don't they? Really bringing people together to solve problems and advance things. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, I mentioned already the fact that for human spaceflight, obviously we have explored the low Earth orbit and used it from a science and practical point of view quite a lot over the last 50 plus years. Of course, there was the Apollo program going to the moon, going for the first time to another celestial body. The idea for the big space agencies like NASA and the Russian Space Agency, the Japanese also, European Space Agency, the Canadians, is really to go beyond the low Earth orbit within the next few decades. Mm-hmm. I mentioned some of the possible targets being Mars or asteroids. Asteroids are a little bit closer and easier to go to. They may not be as interesting as Mars, which is one of the few celestial bodies in the solar system which may have, as I mentioned, harbored life in the past. Some others are Titan, the biggest satellite of Saturn, and Europa, one of the satellites of Jupiter. And Enceladus, another satellite of Saturn. I mean, there are a few places in the solar system where there may have been life, and obviously they are extremely interesting objects to explore, robotically first, but also with a human spacecraft. The big challenge, because you mentioned the challenge, is really human spaceflight beyond the magnetosphere of the Earth. We are exposed to a large amount of radiation, and that's probably the biggest challenge of flights, human flight in the solar system, going away from planet Earth outside of the protection layer of the magnetosphere and the atmosphere.
And in the case of space research, the developments in a way are spurred on by the coming together around a single big challenge. When somebody sets the goal, that really helps define the groups that should come together to solve the problems.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very goal-oriented activity, there's no doubt. And I think one of the reasons for the success of spaceflight, that I was thinking of the 5 successful servicing missions of Hubble that took place between 93 and 2009. They were really, really goal-oriented. There was always a very clear goal. You cannot achieve success if you don't have a clear goal. That's one of the ingredients. Of course, there must be more than that. But on one hand, and also the international cooperation, whether it's on Hubble or the International Space Station.
I like to, I mean, in biology, I mean, there is a lot of goal-oriented to cure Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson and many cancer and so on, which is obvious. But in order to really, these are goal-oriented, but the goals are not so well defined. I mean, because you have to understand basic biology in order to move forward. And you can hope in the future, you know, I entered neuroscience because I wanted to study, my brother had schizophrenia, I wanted to understand that. The only thing I learned about how the eye works and the brain works, I haven't helped psychiatry at all. So it seems to me that we should be wise in
I understand that. Maybe it's a specialty of a space flight, because space flight has a lot of engineering constraint and operation constraint, where we have to be very, very target-oriented and define the path clearly. I can imagine in a lab, it's a different spirit.
So I would say these are two directions for investigation, both of which have to be pursued. And the balance between them is something that is fought over and is messy. But goal-oriented, targeted research and bringing people together around very big, ambitious goals has enormous advantages, and you've called them out in ways that I think we could hardly match. But Torsten's point, and I think it's absolutely critical, is that we still lack so much fundamental knowledge. And even knowing where to look is unknown, and that requires individual genius, individual insight, and we can't forego that kind of curiosity-driven discovery without a purpose, because if we do, we'll never get the tools that we need to tackle the very big challenges that we can begin to articulate. You know, one of my senses of enormous awe still comes from theoretical mathematics and theoretical physics. I don't know how people imagine the challenges or the ideas that they're addressing when they understand quantum chromodynamics, for example, the energy that binds together, the nucleus of an atom. And yet there are people who are inventing the mathematics that describe phenomena that is, frankly, beyond my ability to understand. And we have to make sure that happens. And we also have to make sure that we fund the activities that bring people together, that accomplish the kind of goals that you described.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the similarity in space. You want to find out how the space, what is consists, what is dark matter, a lot of things about space that is exciting, and it's not very useful knowledge necessarily. Maybe in the future that we can survive, as you said, as species, but practically speaking, it's just the knowledge, and I'm very strong supporter also in other fields, in science and physics. You want to know.
So another theme that came up in your talk was the idea of the fusion of young minds, and there are two concepts there I'd like to investigate. First of all, fusion. You referred to it, Sue, the fusion of disciplines. How important is that for frontiers?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. But again, the fusion or the convergence happens in unpredictable ways. If I can imagine a productive convergence, it's already too late. And so, again, making it possible for individuals to find partnerships that allow them to think about things in ways they haven't thought about them, I think is a critical element of being sure that we're keeping the future open to exploration. And the way I think about it is that, I can use what I know to think as far forward as I possibly can. And if I can partner with someone else who can think as far forward as she or he possibly can, we're going to get to a point that neither of us had discovered on our own. And for me, this is kind of the magic of human interaction, where together you can come up with ideas that you could never have come up with on your own. So there's an important role for individual investigator research, solo performer kind of work, but there's also a very important role for collaborative science. And, again, there's a struggle in trying to understand the balance of, where our funding, where our attention should be. But I personally think that I've seen that intersections of disciplines are places of enormous creativity and enormous insight that can only, can't be predicted, but can only be explored when people come together from different perspectives.
Mm. Torsten, you made the point that other disciplines such as engineering are perhaps undervalued.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because, again, for example, if you are a neuroscientist now, robots have become very important because you can have complicated models of how the brain works, and you make circuitry and computers and so on. And the readout is a computer, is a robot, I mean, that will perhaps perform certain functions that you have wired in. And you can't do this kind of work without engineering. So this is just one example. There are other people who do prosthetic work for there are nearly people paralyzed, people who now they have devices that you can think you want to take this glass, and actually it's programmed so that your own desires can guide the arm to the glass so you can drink the water. So those kind of things could not be done without engineers. And this is applied science, but it's a kind of for somebody who is interested in the wiring of the brain and how we can perform all the things we do, then to have a diagram. Ultimately, we want to have a complete wiring diagram of our brains, so that won't happen in our life, any of our lifetimes. But there's something that is fun to think for. I think also the fun of doing, I mean, we have, it's very serious to be scientists, but you don't get good science if it's not done in the spirit of curiosity and trying to find out and play around with things. And so that shouldn't be forgotten.
Now you raise it, let me raise fun and beauty together. Who wants to tackle fun and beauty?
It is, at least in my experience, the great joy of being a scientist. I had my graduate advisor was a neuroanatomist. I'm a neuroanatomist by training. And at one point, as we were studying the structure of nerve cells and how they connect to one another, I guess it was perhaps a low moment for me during my PhD work. And I asked him why he did what he did, draw Golgi neurons, do electron microscopy. And he looked at me as though I were an idiot. And he said, I do it because it's beautiful. And I have cherished that observation through my career because it is this curiosity, this drive that we have to understand and to see things come together in ways that once you see it, it makes perfect sense. It's beautiful.
Of course, you talked about...
I talk about beauty a lot, yeah. I mean, if I did not convey my enthusiasm for what I had the privilege to do, then I have to start again. Yeah, of course, it's a world. It's an unbelievable world. I mean, sometimes it's so beautiful you want to cry.
Mm-hmm. Really. So what is it about the human brain that allows us to have this experience of joy, of beauty? It's will we get to that, Torsten?
Yeah, sometime. I mean, not in my lifetime or yours, but we will. I also feel that brain science. I mean, you don't want to know too much either. I mean, because I remember when I was at Harvard, I had a named professorship, and the guy who gave the money, we had lunch, and he asked Torsten, when we'll be able to control the brain. Mm-hmm. So I looked at him and said, never, I hope. And the danger, of course, is, and in the future, when we know more about that, like in all other advances in science, that it can be misused, like the nuclear discoveries that led to, as we all know. So I think in the future, we may have to worry about ethics as well in some of the scientific explorations that will. Right now, I don't think in my field of neuroscience that's a serious problem, but it's good to think about it, I think.
But I mean, again, thinking about the public appreciation of what scientists do, again, the public appreciate the beauty of space, but I don't know whether they really appreciate the beauty of biology. It's hard to know. But maybe something to think about. So another thing was young minds. Are the frontiers the preserve of the young?
Yeah.
As a 90-year-old, what would you say?
Yeah. In Sweden, I lived 3 months interval in Sweden and New York. And in Sweden, I was part of starting a young academy, an academy for young scientists. These are scientists who, maybe 5 years after they have got the position, they're still not tenured. And they can come to this academy, they are selected very carefully, and they can stay in the academy for 5 years, and they have to get out. The trouble with most academy, in my view, is that they have become an honor society. So people want to be members of an academy, and because that means that you have been established. But the Young Academy is for young scientists from all areas, not only in science, humanities, law. They come together and they have meetings and they talk about what they do. And they make contact with government to get more support for various things. So at HFSP, we started a Young Investigator Award because it tends to be more difficult for young scientists to get support. It's true. In the United States now, you have to, first time you get the grant, on average you are 42 years old. And used to be, when I was young, used to be 35, 36 years of age. So we need to worry about, see to that, and I think it's the same problem in Japan. We had a applicant to HFSP some years back. We said that you're too old to apply for a young investigator. Yes, but now I have become professor, so now I'm independent. so it's, I think we should worry about, very much about C2, that in people, I mean, in mathematics, and for example, the mind is often best between the age of 17 to 30, when, you know, and I think creativity in biology lasts longer, but we really, in order to get full advantage of talent out in the world, we should see too that we support young people better than we do now.
Yeah, so I agree entirely with what Torsten has said, but one of the things I discovered about science that I think is absolutely beautiful and important is the interplay of ages and the interplay of intellects. MIT has a program where undergraduates enter labs. It's called the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program, and a lot of undergraduates will do research. And faculty tell me that they give their hardest problems to the undergraduates because they don't know what's impossible. And that kind of exhilaration and undaunted approach is incredibly useful. But to have young minds together with experienced minds is among the most delightful interplays. And you know, the way our society is, it is not so common that young people get to work side by side with more experienced people. And it happens in scientific laboratories at the best of times. And it is a glorious, again, collaboration to have a senior scientist who has long perspective, a lot of experience working with a young person who is undaunted, doesn't know that anything's impossible, and to, you know, I think it breeds optimal productivity to bring both sets, the old and the young, together.
Yeah, the mentorship, of course, is yes. part of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I would go even to a younger age. I mean, in schools, trying to show the school children, age 10, 12, 15, the fun of curiosity and discovering, right. And you know, what is behind the mountain, what is behind that wall, and it's fun, and you can plant that seed quite early before they go to academic life.
Absolutely. I would say the seed is there, and we managed to kill it. And figuring out how not to kill it is an important goal for education.
That's very important, because every 8-year-old is already working at the frontier, and then somehow that's most right. of them pull away from it.
Right.
That's right.
Who knows why?
Yeah, every 5-year-old's an inventor, yeah. And somehow we managed to persuade them they don't know how to do it, they can't do it.
That's a whole other discussion, yes. For a whole other program another day. Does anybody want to comment on that aspect of the importance of transnational teams coming together in order to advance science?
Yeah. I sort of have spent a fair amount of time since I left the president, Rockefeller, to try to develop ways of what people have been called using science for peace. There is there are different organizations. There is in brain science, an International Brain Research Organization, which has in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and in America, have regional groups, and they receive funds from a central office in Paris to develop their own programs, workshop, etc. And then the chair of each regional group is a member of the executive committee of the organization. In this way, you create a situation where there is but the ownership in individual countries of a program at the same time that is a global interaction. So this is a model I think is something we should all strive for. Other fields could do similarly. But I think neuroscience is the only field of science that I know that has, there may be some in physics or in your field in the exploration of outer space. I mean, you mentioned at our lunch that there was that you have an international.
It must be an interesting dynamic between competition between nations in space and also the obvious need for and benefit of collaboration.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's kind of a balance between the two that takes you to success. There's no doubt about that. There's both of them. Cooperation. I mean, if you compare the beginning of human space exploration, which was totally in the Cold War, so it was total competition between the Soviet Union and the US, which of course brought a good result because the Apollo program was a result of this fierce competition and the very, very strong will of the US to be successful in the next step of human space exploration. But now we have mainly cooperation, but it's obvious that a certain competition spirit is there too.
What about China in your field?
Well, China has made great achievement in, of course, in satellites and launches and space technology in general, but also in human space exploration. But they have done this on their own.
There's no interaction between you?
No, there's not, but I'm sure that someday it will come. And obviously, because the Chinese have developed all these systems by themselves, they will put a much stronger card on the table that they will become part of a bigger cooperation. So I think the Chinese are doing the right thing to learn by themselves first before we will someday work together. I'm convinced we will.
Susan.
Can I pick up both Claude's and Torsten's point? Because one of the powers of science that I think we underappreciated as scientists is the role of academic diplomacy. It is not true in every field, but in science and engineering, the vocabulary is the same. Neuroscience in Boston is the same as neuroscience in Beijing and neuroscience in Berlin and neuroscience in Buenos Aires. And it gives us a route for communicating across nations that is unusual. And I think it's a very important force and one that the HFSP has encouraged. And I think it's a tremendously important force for peace and force for understanding. And as I said, as scientists, we don't really think about it. I remember when I first became dean of the graduate school at Yale, my first assignment was to be on a panel about internationalization. And I thought, what is that about? You know, as a neuroscientist, there aren't any national boundaries. You know, people study the same thing wherever they are. But what I learned very rapidly, it is not true in history. It is not true in literature. And so the community, the international community of scientists, I think, can play a larger role in increasing the international conversation and the conversation around peace and sharing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. So may I invite other questions, comments, thoughts from the audience? Please.
I noticed that the members of the panel haven't mentioned Mario Botta, and I wonder whether they can specify the dynamics behind scientific breakthroughs and architectural breakthroughs. Some ideas for this occurred to me. One is clearly imagination. One looks at those extraordinary photographs of his buildings. He clearly had that. Secondly, determination. These breakthroughs are not always accepted or eagerly accepted by people. you have to have guts and determination and courage to push them through, and also simply enthusiasm, which he clearly displayed in what he was saying. So I wonder whether you'd like to comment on that.
Can I just add another piece of it, which is perhaps too mundane? Technology, new materials, new technologies that allow you to build buildings that have never, design buildings that have never been designed before, never been able to be built before. Someone might have been able to imagine them, perhaps. I don't think they could have imagined your buildings exactly. But the technology that allows new kinds of structures to be built today that could never have been built 25 years ago.
You may want to comment on it.
Grazie di avermi coinvolto. Almeno nel mio.
Yes, thank you for this question, for your comments. So in my work, there is a sort of very rational process on one side, because when you have to work on a building, you've got to change or to modify an existing balance between that new building and the place, the pre-existing places. So architecture basically transforms a natural condition into a cultural condition, thus modifying a consolidated balance and creates a new unknown balance. So there is a deduction, a rational deduction process in the first step. And in the second step, there is, a sort of irrational, creative, and risky process. We take some risks in the same way as you were telling about scientists. So scientists do not know everything. So we also take risks when we design new buildings. And there is also sort of ethical tension. So we're working on something that will become beautiful, but because the objectives that we are aiming at are beautiful, not because what we are doing is beautiful now,
It's sort of interesting that in studying the brain and the cortex of the brain, how we perceive things, we've made findings that the cortex is organized. We call it cortical architecture. Again, we come back to the concept of beauty. It's because the architectural structure within our brains is also. Even you probably would enjoy seeing the space being. It's often a question how to sort out different things in vision, for example, color from orientation of things, and so you need to segregate things, and you do that architecturally.
There is also the extraordinarily important point of the function of the architecture and how that relates to Susan's point earlier of how you bring people together in a space that allows them to interact and encourages them to form synthetic advances.
Yeah, so we've all seen in science architecture that works, that encourages conversation and collaboration, and architecture that doesn't. So there are some architects who focus on the human dynamic and enable interactions that really amplify individuals' abilities, individuals' efforts.
That also means that there are many who take the wrong path.
Yes.
And and this is part of it. To fail, you have to give credit to people who try, even if they don't always succeed. That's I think, important.
I would like to also go to that poem, but I give you a different interpretation. You see, the moment that way gets visible, you could take one interpretation. There are hundreds of them. I think it's a wonderful poem. It's when the way is visible, that could be the moment a discipline is started. And I want to talk about the usefulness and the inhibition of disciplines. And interdisciplinarity also needs that disciplines exist. Yes. But what is very interesting, if you look at the foundations of molecular biology, when the structure of DNA gets discovered and so on, it's an environment of change and transformation which is inherently interdisciplinary at that time. Sanger was chemistry, physicists, X-ray, DNA. People try to find this with this curiosity. What is actually DNA? Where is the information? Is it in the protein, in the DNA? It's still very close. A very naturally interdisciplinary space. Where are we today in a molecular biology lab? We hire molecular biologists trained in molecular biology, and we have a hard time to get a physicist or an engineer close to it. So when this way gets established, we have an established discipline, and it becomes inhibitory in some ways to the frontier. So the frontier, per se, is happening in a virtual or real transformational place, and that is inherently interdisciplinary.
You should visit Okinawa.
You should speak a little bit about the Institute.
No, I mean, I think that you need to create an environment that makes it not inhibitory to have this interaction, but you have actually facilitate interaction. So at the Okinawa Institute of Science Technology, we have no departments and the student, and we have faculty from different disciplines. And the students have to rotate in physics and in chemistry and biology to be exposed. And this is one way of trying this to happen. This was happening in Cambridge during the MRC time when DNA discoveries were made. And we need to create milieus and environment of that kind. I agree.
Okay, please. Did you want to make another comment? Yes.
Molto brevemente, è una constatazione. Io dei tre
briefly, very shortly, what the three panelists have said. Well, they have something in common. They have a common denominator because they have all of them have mentioned beauty. Nicollier for the space and its images. Susan Hockfield for the beauty of research, so how beautiful it is to be a scientist, to be a researcher, while supporting the curiosity and the willingness of finding new things, and the neurobiologists, neuroscientists for exploring new worlds in the brain. So first of all, I'd like to thank you, all of them, because I think that there are many similarities, though I am a bricklayer, I build walls, I'm a carpenter, and nonetheless, there are many similarities with my job between what you do and what I do. That is the definition of Stendhal, talking about beauty, not as an objective, as a goal, but when it states that beauty is a promise of happiness. So that's what I think.
So I see that we've used up pretty much our entire time. We've only just scratched the surface of the subject, but perhaps this serves as a springboard for discussions that will continue over the coming days. I was going to ask, if we had 2 minutes at the end, if anybody wanted to make any prediction about any sort of frontier we might be sitting here discussing in 25 years when we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of HFSP. Perhaps, Claude Nicollier, you're the person who might be most able to predict what's going to happen in 25 years' time.
Well, I think one of the great question we have is life in the universe. Are we alone? I mean, this is a big question, and a lot of scientific investigation now, be it here on the ground or in space, or with telescopes pointed to stars or globular clusters or interstellar matter, or planets around other stars than the sun, exoplanets. we are obsessed with this question: are we alone in the universe? And I hope that in 25 years we'll have an answer to that. And of course, if we have not found anything, we will still be searching. But hopefully, we'll have an answer. And it doesn't mean that we will have received a signal that we can decipher, but possibly we will have the proof. Yes, there is life elsewhere in the universe. That'd be great.
And if we have, then there's a whole new influx of applications to HFSP, no doubt. So, good. Please join me in thanking our three panelists and our contributors from the audience.